I'm going to start personal and then get economic on you. My great-grandfather in California built the railroad from Santa Cruz to San Francisco, along with other Korean and Chinese. He was a supervisor on that project because he could speak Korean, Chinese, and English. My grandfather was a child miner in Wyoming. Children can go into very small crevices and get the last pieces of coal. Needless to say, there were many accidents, and he almost died in many of them, but didn't. My parents were farm workers. My father started picking grapes when he was 6 years old. My mother when she was 8. If you look at, the next time you eat raisins, think about the fact that children pick those grapes, and children lay out those grapes on trays to dry in the sun. The children who lay out the grapes, of course, are not paid. My mother and her family were interned in World War II because they were Japanese American. So my family's history is a history of race in this country, and it's a history of class in this country. So much of what has been said in this conference, much of what will be said, applies to my family and to myself. So yes, these things on race do apply to Asian Americans as well. We had no human capital education, no capital, wealth, no social capital, connections, and of course, as many people will talk about, those are important in this country to get ahead. I'm 4th generation Asian American. I will always be seen as foreign, as not American, as other. The only other language I can speak is a little bit of Spanish because I grew up in Los Angeles in an immigrant area. So Asians are invisible. We're the invisible minorities. We're invisible because people don't think we suffer. So as Bill has said, some are doing well if they had education and wealth, but many are doing badly, like those from Southeast Asia. So we're a very bimodal population. During the Great Recession, we had the highest rate of long-term unemployment, for instance. We're also invisible because we're so few. So we don't count. So last night, the Reverend discussed race and class. Today, I want to add a gender dimension to the discussions on this conference and the intersection of race and gender. In this research, there are not good theories about gender and race. In economics, they tend to explain either gender or race, but not both at the same time. So many of us turn to other disciplines to explain gender and race and the intersection much better. These include law, philosophy, multicultural studies, feminist studies, critical theory. So scholars in these other disciplines talk about the fact that women of color suffer from 2 different sources of bias or discrimination. One is by race, and as Thomas discussed, there's inequality by race in wealth. That's certainly true of earnings as well. Using the same methodology, you find that African Americans have lower earnings because they get different rewards, lower opportunities in the work market. The same is true for Latinos who have accents. The same is true for many Asian Americans as well. In addition, there's, of course, a glass ceiling certainly by gender, but also by Asian Americans. The same other scholars, of course, find that there's gender disparities, that the same is true, that the same achievements give different rewards, lower rewards for women. So for instance, women graduating from the same university with the same GPA and the same major earn less than men. So you can't say it's a different choice or different interests. You find that women have higher performance appraisals from their employers, but they get lower raises from those higher performance appraisals and are less likely to be promoted. Performance appraisals are the evaluations that companies often do every year. So we do find disparities by race and by gender, but many scholars also believe that there's an intersectional component as well between race and gender. That the effect of race and gender for women of color may not be the sum of their race and gender parts. That the effect of race and gender can be less than the total amount of bias or discrimination women of color face. Or the effect of race and gender can be greater than the total amount of bias or discrimination they face. This can be the case, for instance, if race and gender count for affirmative action, so you're more likely to be hired or favored than someone who's just African American or just female. In the former case, that race and gender penalties are less than the total amount of discrimination or bias you face. This could mean that the particular combination of being African American and a woman is particularly bad or awful or odious. You don't know how to deal with people who have multiple oppressions. The other thing is that people believe that the interaction between gender and race is complex, that it can change. It could vary depending on what you're looking at, hiring, promotion, training, mentoring, so that sometimes race is more relevant in the outcome, sometimes gender is more relevant in the outcome, such as work and family issues, for instance, and sometimes the intersection of race and gender can produce unique outcomes. So I came in late last night and I heard part of the discussion yesterday about gender. And I think what we need to think about is, why are women always on the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy? Why are racial and ethnic minorities always on the bottom of socioeconomic hierarchies? Why is this true of every society throughout time? So to explain this, I agree with Jack on what he said yesterday, that the critical theories, the theories that look at power and wealth, and how power is replicated, how it's perpetuated, how groups that oppose the status quo are punished or killed, are better explanations of why this is true. Gender disparities, race disparities, and especially the intersection of race and gender, and are better explanations than many of the economic theories we have. So most research claims that you can't measure the intersection between gender and race. The result is that very little work has been done in this area. So what do you do when you're interested in something and you're told you can't do it? You do it anyway. So what I found is that African American women suffer a gender penalty of 15%. Their earnings are 15% lower because of their gender. They suffer an additional penalty because of their race of 9%. But in addition, they suffer an intersectional component of 3%, so that their earnings are 3% lower because of the intersection of their race and gender. So people say that women of color face double discrimination because of their gender and race. It's actually worse than that. It's triple discrimination because of their race, their gender, and the intersection of gender and race add a third component. So to do this research, I use the same technique that Tom uses, but I add a new twist to it. And I try to explain wage differences by race and gender and the intersection. And what this does, this is the old one, all right. This methodology does two things. It accounts for wages after taking in consideration all the factors that can explain race and gender differences, such as education level, work experience, living in high wage versus low wage areas. So you're trying to account for factors that could explain race or gender differentials. But you also want to do a second thing. When accounting for these factors, you examine what would the wages be of African American women if they had, as Tom said, the same returns as other workers, if they were treated the same in the labor markets as other workers. So what I look at is, what are the wages of African American women if they're treated as white women? That's the measure of the race gap. What are the wages of African American women if they were treated as African American men? This is the gender gap. And finally, what are the wages of African American women if they were treated as white men or had the same returns as white men? This then is the total wage gap, those due to gender and race. I then look at this total wage gap and I compare it to the sum of the race and gender gaps to see if the total gap is greater, less, or equal to the sum of the race and gender gaps. I'm getting some nods. Okay. Some of you are with me. I look from 1980 to 2014. I had to use different data sets because the 2000, they didn't have some of the variables I needed. And the results are kind of interesting. For African American women, again, there are race penalties for their earnings. They have lower wages because of their race. They have lower wages because of their gender. And the race plus the gender earnings is less than the total penalties they face. So once again, instead of double discrimination, facing discrimination or bias because of the race and gender, there's triple discrimination or triple penalties because of their race, their gender, and the intersection of the race and gender. So if this isn't clear, it means you're penalized to be a woman. It's bad to be a woman in the labor force. Your earnings are less. It's bad to be African American in the labor force. Your wages are even lower. And it's worse to be both a woman and African American. You're penalized even more. I looked at changes in these penalties and over time. And what you find, which is interesting, is that the intersectional penalty is steady. It doesn't change over time. The gender penalty goes down, which is consistent with other studies that show that women face lower penalties in the workforce than they used to. What's interesting, though, is that the race penalty for African American women has gone up. Some people think that it's because white women were able to get into higher paid professional jobs more easily than African American women. So the race difference between white and African American women went up over these years. So to conclude, there are penalties in the earnings of African American women. There are penalties in the earnings of women as well. And there's an additional penalty with the combination of being an African American woman. That over time, the gender penalty has gone down. The intersectional penalty of being African American and a woman has remained the same, but the race penalty for African American women has gone up from 1980 to the present. So what does this mean? I want to answer Robert Johnson's question that he raised last night. What does this mean? Things are worse than we think. There is a gender penalty, there's a race penalty, and there's an additional problem of the intersection. And so this is important. That economics is not explaining these. I think it's because we have bankrupt theories, because we've had positivism where you have to predict things rather than going back to an institutional approach where you look around and you explain what you see and what's going on. We probably need to change our assumptions and our approach in economics, because models that are based on atomistic, independent people maximizing utility, being greedy, and that leads to the best of all worlds. You get one outcome in inequality, for instance, and models based on a compassionate economy where people care for other people for free, such as women, such as neighbors, such as minority communities helping each other, you get different outcomes as well. So when Robert Johnson says, what can we do? What can the economics profession do? Let's change our assumptions. Let's change our models. And let's change the practice of this institution. The American Economic Review is no longer anonymous. And we know that people with women's names, ethnic names, are less likely, their work is less likely to be seen as good compared to Anglo names. And we have a job market in economics that assumes you have money to fly across the country and stay at a hotel and interview for jobs, which is not necessarily true for everyone in the profession. So finally, we can't compartmentalize gender, race, and the intersection of gender and race. It is complex. We've been looking to other disciplines to explain reality much better, but the economics profession can fund and publish better analyses that can explain this reality, and I think this conference is a great step in going forward with that. Thank you.